Chapter 11. Famine. A cry of joy was carried up and echoed throughout the caravan as soon as they had heard the news that they had come at last to journey's end. Some sang, some danced, some wept tears of joy, and others laughed aloud and knelt down to kiss the grass that grew there. After so many days in the barren desert, the land of Canaan was a paradise. Indeed, after the initial shock and awe of finally finding the land that he had seen in dreams in the waking world, a feeling of pride filled Abram's breast. He had made the journey by foot all this way, and now had come into the land of promise that was a veritable Eden. But, unlike Noah, who was barred from entering Eden, and, after the deluge, lost that paradise forever, he, Abram son of Terah, had found that paradise, and was not going to leave. Abram gave the command for the caravan to make for the lower ground. He had it in mind to erect an altar in that ground, and offer a sacrifice of thanks to the Eternal for the safe guard on their long journey, even as Noah had done after leaving the ark. They made haste, for so great was their joy that any thought of weariness was gone from them. Yea, it seemed that the rolling hills hastened them on their way down the side of the great mountain. They and their camels and their herds practically leapt down the mountainside, the bells on the collars of the flocks and the saddles of the camels pealing loudly as they went. But their joy was soon to be cut short. Cries were heard coming from the town below. A company of riders on horse and camel rode out from the town to meet the caravan. Now the cries of joy became cries of alarm. Servants rushed to protect the flocks from being scattered, while some of them took up their staves and made a circle around the caravan. Abram now returned to the forefront of the caravan, one hand upon his staff and the other upon the hilt of the dagger in his belt. He thought of flight for a moment, but that was impossible. They were now at the bottom of the mountain, and having lost the high ground, they were vulnerable. Any attempt to retreat back up it would be disastrous. Nor was flight to the right hand or to the left possible, for the horsemen riding out of the town in single file now began to surround them on either side. Escape was impossible. "O merciful God," Abram whispered, "you who have saved me from the fire of Nimrod, show mercy now and spare us from the sword of the Amorites." The riders now made a semicircle around the front of the caravan. They were close enough now that they could be seen. Each one wore the garb of the desert folk. Each wore a robe without a belt around the waist, a cloak about their shoulders, and a keshe upon the head. Every one of them was armed to the teeth. The spear was the most common weapon, a long staff of wood with a brass pointed end, but some bore bows in their hand and quivers upon their back, and these bows were fitted with arrows upon the string that was aimed directly at the caravan, though their bows were not bent. 3 of them bore short, one-handed swords at their hips in leather scabbards, daggers in their belts, and axes as well. These 3, Abram assumed, were their chieftains. Not only did they bear bronze knives and swords, icons of wealth and status, but they were the tallest of the ones here. For the moment, no attack was made against the caravan. No spear was thrown, no arrow was loosed. One of the chieftains spoke some words to his companions, but Abram could not rightly guess what they said. He turned to Eleazar, who was at his right hand, staff in hand, ready to fight to the last. "Do you know what language they speak, Eleazar?" he asked. "Yes, my lord," Eleazar replied. "It is the Akkadian language, the common tongue in Canaan. By the look, these men are Amorites. Use caution, my lord. We don't want to learn here and now if the legends of their barbarism are true." "Duly noted," Abram whispered, "which is why you shall accompany me as a translator." Presently, the chieftain who was speaking had dismounted off of his horse and was approaching Abram. The old man stood his ground, staff in hand, and Eleazar at his side. As Abram spoke, Eleazar would translate for him, and when the chieftain spoke to Abram, Eleazar would translate the language back to him in his own language. "Peace be with you, my lord," Abram greeted. "I am Abram, son of Terah. I have come to this land to sojourn, me and my house and my flocks. We come in peace, and mean no harm to any of you. Eleazar repeated in Akkadian every word of what Abram said to the chieftains accurately and clearly. The chieftain pointed to himself with an open hand, and then to the two other chieftains, and spoke his reply in his language. "He says his name is Mamre," Eleazar translated. "He is the prince of this land, with his brothers Eshcol and Aner." The chieftain Mamre spoke something which brought a look of surprise upon Eleazar's face. He spoke to him back in Akkadian, pointing towards the trees behind them. While Abram did not speak a word of Akkadian yet, he could tell from the raised tone that something Eleazar had done had offended the Amorite. "What is he saying?" "He says that it's impolite to gesture with one finger," Eleazar humbly replied. Mamre spoke again. "He says that he wants you to follow him to the grove below in the plain. Something I don't quite understand. He says the tree will judge you?" "What madness is this?" Abram asked. Eleazar asked, in a polite manner, about what had been said. Mamre gave him his answer. "He says the oaks of this plain are sacred," Eleazar replied. "He says that their branches will not shelter a malefactor. Some desert superstition, I think. Ask him what will happen to me if I stand underneath the tree." The question was asked, and the reply was given. "He says that if you are true, the tree will cover you with the shade of its branches, and if you are false, they will not. And then they will kill you and take your possessions for themselves." Mamre continued, gesturing to Abram's caravan with an open palm. "He says that you have no choice. Your little band of goatherds cannot defend yourselves against us, should we attack. My lord, it would be wise to go with him." Abram quietly said a prayer to the eternal God to be with him, and to save him from the hand of these superstitious Amorites. After he had thus prayed, he said to Mamre, "I will go with you to the oak grove." Eleazar translated this, and Mamre nodded. He then turned to his brothers and gave the orders to them. Many of their riders remained guarding the caravan, while 4 others followed Mamre, Abram, and Eleazar down into the grove of the oak trees. As they were on their way, a wind blew upon them from the north, shaking all the branches and leaves of the oak trees. Into Abram's mind came a thought of fear. Had he come all this way, through the hardships of desert and wilderness, only to die here in the land of promise on account of superstitious Amorites, whose hearts were stirred at the rattling of tree branches in the wind? Then again, into his mind, came the memory of the encounter with Nimrod and the fire. He had survived worse than merely a summer breeze in oaken branches, by the free, unmerited pardon of the eternal God, on account only of his faith in him. Into his mind came this thought: if he truly believed that the Eternal was God, then he knew that he had power over the wind as well as the fire. Turning inward, with each step closer to the great oak, Abram prayed, "I have done as you asked, O merciful God, creator of heaven and earth," he said. "I left my country, my people, and the house of my father, and came to the land that you showed me. And now that I have come here, I am in danger of my life from the unbelieving Amorites. Save me, Eternal, that it be not said that you led me out into the wilderness to die." At last, too soon for Abram's liking, they came before the largest and tallest of the oak trees in the area. Its branches were swaying about in the wind, and the shadows therefrom danced about beneath them. At the edge of the branch's shade, the 4 soldiers guarded Abram and Eleazar, while Mamre stood before the great tree and gestured for Abram to approach him. Slowly, Abram stepped out from the circle of the 4 soldiers and passed under the shadow of the oak's branches. To the surprise of everyone there, the wind blowing through the branches ceased, and they stirred themselves no more. Abram was now under the branches of the oak tree, and they remained still. Suddenly Mamre let out a loud laugh, then came near to Abram and kissed him upon each cheek, before uttering words to his soldiers and the 2 of them. "He says that we are not enemies to him," Eleazar replied. "He extends to us the hand of hospitality. He says there will be a feast this evening." It was quite an awkward situation in which the travelers found themselves. What had once appeared to be a band of wild, murderous savages were now welcoming them in with friendship. Abram set up his tents in the plain, away off from the grove of oak trees, and here they were to have their feast. Mamre sent some of his men into the town to bring food and drink for the feast, which would be done here in Abram's tents, in the shadow of the oak trees. In the tent of Abram, the feast was underway. Most of what the Amorites brought to their table had been bought or plundered from one or another of the cities under their protection. To the road-weary travelers, it was a feast indeed. Fresh fruit, flat cakes of bread dipped in honey, oil, or savory spices, ripe cheeses, wine of unsurpassed quality, and meat, plenty of meat to go around, which, to shepherd folk as they were, was a rare delicacy. Abram ate all of these, save for the meat, for he guessed, rightly, that the meat was not free of blood, and he would be violating the law of Noah to eat the life and blood even of a beast. At the feast, the nobles reclined upon the cushions as they ate. Abram and Sarai attended the highest place of the table, with Mamre, Aner, and Eshcol at Abram's right, with Lot and Addo at his left, opposite Sarai. It was hardly a proper table, even by the standards of the time. It was little more than an additional rug upon which the food was placed for them to eat. As they ate, Abram noticed the Amorite princes as they ate. None of them asked what they were offered, but ate and drank with reckless abandon, and belched loudly. Eleazar, who stood behind Abram's seat and translated for him at need, informed him that it was the custom in this land to belch as a sign of gratitude at a feast. While they ate, Mamre spoke to Abram in Akkadian. He asks, "What brings you to Shechem?" Eleazar translated. "What is Shechem?" Abram asked in return. Eleazar gave the question, and Mamre answered it. "He says the town is Shechem," was the answer. "It's a center of trade and lies under his protection." Abram nodded. "Tell my lord Mamre that I have come here to sojourn, following the will of my God." Eleazar gave the translation. Mamre seemed confused and asked him a question. He asks, "Which God is the one who brought you to this land?" "The eternal God, creator of heaven and earth," Abram replied. Eleazar translated this. Mamre shook his head and spoke his reply. "He says they've never heard of your God before," Eleazar told Abram. "He wants to know where you came from." "From Paran Haran," Abram answered. When the word was spoken, a tense silence fell upon the feast, and 3 pair of eyes fixated upon Abram with distrust. Mamre was the first to speak, concluding his sentence with a defiant spit upon the rug. "He says that Padan is near to the land of Nimrod," Eleazar said. "He says that Nimrod is his enemy. He is an ally of the Elamites, whom Mamre hates. Tell him that we are not friends of Nimrod, or Chedorlaomer," Abram stated. "Tell him that Nimrod sought our life, which was why we left his land." Eleazar said these words to Mamre. To their surprise, the Amorite chieftain smiled and laughed, then spoke words to Abram. "He says that any enemy of Nimrod is a friend to him," Eleazar translated. "He says that you are no mean man yourself. You have many flocks and herds, and your lovely wife is decked with gold and silver. He wishes to make a covenant with you." "A covenant?" Abram asked. "Ask him what this covenant would entail." Eleazar asked, and Mamre gave his answer. "He says that he will allow you to live in this land and protect you from Nimrod and his allies. In exchange, he will require a yearly tithe of man, beast, and gold, 1/10 of your goats, 1/10 of your sheep, 1/10 of your cattle, 1/10 of your servants, and 1/10 of your gold. He also asks that you fight in his battles when he calls for you. This covenant shall last for as long as you shall live." Abram didn't give this much thought. He had seen the flippant change of the humors of the Amorites before his eyes, and so he decided that it would not be too much of a burden in exchange for safety living in this land. Abram nodded in approval. The Amorites then called for a cow to be slaughtered upon a stone before the great oak. While this was done, the cups were all filled with wine, and Sarai brought Abram's cup to him. Once they were all filled, Abram, Mamre, Aner, and Eshcol stood before the stone as the cow's throat was slit before them. Mamre spoke the part of the covenant which he and his brothers would fulfill, and Eleazar translated it for Abram. Once they were done, Abram spoke the part which he would fulfill, and Eleazar translated it. Then they drank a portion from their cups, and poured out the rest upon the offering. That evening, once the Amorites had left, Abram was outside the camp. The twilight was cool, and the fires of the camp made the emerald hillside glow. Yet in this environment, Abram felt distinctly alone. Sarai was seeing to the servants while he was out here, alone with his thoughts. He looked up at the shadow of the tree, wondering if there had indeed been some power within that tree which had stood still when he stood beneath its branches. While he stood there pondering, a figure in hooded robes approached him. When the voice spoke, he knew who had spoken to him. "Metatron," Abram spoke up, "I have done as the eternal God asked. I came here to the land that he showed me. What more does the eternal wish of me?" But for the present, the angel was silent. He approached Abram, and then finally spoke.
"Think not that this tree had any power in itself to save you, Abram, son of Terah."
Metatron spoke.
"All things lie under the power of the Almighty God. It was his hand that held back the wind in the trees, for he has given a time of mercy to the Amorites for your sake, for the cup of their iniquity is not yet filled. As for you, Abram, son of Terah, the Almighty has said that you shall lack for nothing, for you shall be blessed in all that you do, and unto your seed shall he give this land as an inheritance."
No sooner had the angel spoken, but he vanished yet again. Abram immediately went about looking for stones. He chose large ones, which felt as natural and unhewn as possible. He could have had servants do this work for him, yet he decided to do this for himself. He was the one whom the eternal God had deigned to speak to, and it was he who would be the one to do this. His heart raced within his chest as he did this, filling him with a great warmth all throughout his body. His faith had been confirmed, and he knew that the Eternal was with him, no matter where he went. Once the altar was built, he gathered dry branches from the oak trees that lay strewn upon the ground and piled these upon the altar, then went back to the camp and selected a choice lamb, without spot or blemish, and took also a torch of fire with him. He remembered the story of Abel, and chose rather to accept the Eternal's favor rather than his disregard. Placing the lamb's neck upon the stones of the altar, he removed the knife from his belt and slit the beast's throat as swiftly and mercifully as possible. It hurt his heart to sacrifice something so precious to him, but it reminded him that the Eternal was not satisfied with the table scraps of his servants, but the absolute best of the best. Once the beast ceased moving, Abram wiped the dagger upon the lamb's fleece, returned it to his belt, then heaved the carcass upon to the altar. With the torch he had, Abram set fire to the branches. The flames of the sacrifice rose up into the night sky, and the smoke thereof vanished in the night sky. But the new life they had found was not much easier than it had been in Padan. In fact, it was quite difficult. They went this way and that, moving with the water and pasture they could find. There were other tribes here and there in this land, many of whom were less friendly than the Amorites. The warlike Philistines dwelt in the southernmost coasts of Canaan, with cities on the shores of the great sea. Day after day, week after week, month after month, season after season, year after year, they lived out their lives in this rugged land. Yet despite the hardships, the flocks of Abram and Lot flourished greatly. A yearly tithe was little to Abram. Lot did not pay any such tithe, for he was under Abram's protection and had made no covenant. As the years went by, Abram learned the Akkadian language and could speak it as fluently as Eleazar could. He often found himself going to and fro from the southern lands, as far as Beersheba to the plain of Mamre. The marketplace at Shechem was as worthy a place of commerce and news from all parts of these lands as that of Padan had been. Once again they sold the wares that they had made from the flocks and herds, and became very wealthy. The towns, Abram learned in time, were not actually owned by the Amorites, but had been built by Canaanites under Mamre's protection. They lived in caves in the wilderness, where some believed the giants were also dwelling in hiding with them, The Elamites had recently invaded the lands beyond the Jordan and drove out the Emims and the Horims in the southern parts around Mount Seir. Concerning the goings-on in the wide world outside of Shechem, Abram heard to some degree here at Shechem and elsewhere, such as at Luz. Apparently, the loss that Nimrod had suffered at the hands of Chedorlaomer had created a power vacuum that saw the steady rise of a new power in the region of Padan. The sons of Heth, another one of the usurping house of Ham, was carving out a place of power for themselves in the far north and in the region near Padan. Yet for the present, they were little more than newcomers to the land of Canaan, and under the watchful eye of the Amorite chieftains, as was everyone else. Days went on by, and the flocks of Abram moved about this way and that in the region, going in a circuit between Shechem, Luz, and the southern region near Beersheba. Eleazar would often be sent in Abram's stead to watch over the flocks and supervise the other servants, while he himself would spend time teaching those whom he encountered about the eternal God. Sarai herself was not idle, but tended to the needs of their servants and their families, and was always busy with her hands in some form or another. Life in the wilds of Canaan was much different than life in Ur or Padan. In addition to this, she gave her husband something special, which she herself made for him under his guidance. Abram knew the wedged cuneiform writing common in Ur, Padan, and Canaan, but there was little need for writing in these parts. In the 25 years he had lived in Ur and Padan, he learned how to read and write, as well as the higher sciences of arithmetic and astronomy. Every night, he would gaze at the stars and watch the phases of the moon. 12 times a year, the new moon was hidden in the night sky, as was the command of the Eternal, that the lights in the heavens be for signs and days and years. Using some thread of fine color, Sarai knitted a bracelet of cloth with tiny beads of thread to reflect how many years Abram had walked this land. White for a jubilee of 50 years, red for a score of years, blue for a single year, and beige for the number of months. Every new moon, she would have him bring the bracelet back to her, and sew in the next month, and at the end of the year, she would remove the 12 collected beige beads and sew in a blue one. By this, and other means, they calculated how many years they had accumulated and how long they had been in Canaan. But life was about to get exceedingly more difficult for them. From the north, rumors began to circulate of a drought falling upon the land, bringing famine in its wake. Those who had business in the north reported that the increase of the crops was even less fruitful than it had been in a long count of years. Worse still was the word that this was not improving, but instead growing worse and moving steadily southward. Days passed, and the green hills outside of Shechem became brown and dull. There was less and less grazing land for the flocks, and the cattle started to grow thin and hungry. Of course, as the animals suffered, so their keepers suffered. Food and water were rationed in order to prevent the flocks or the people from starving, but even that was not enough. One evening, Lot came from his tent to Abram's tent, where Sarai was busy mending a hole in a robe. As he approached, he threw himself down at Sarai's feet in respect. "Please, brother," Sarai said, "do not bow to me." Let me speak, my lady," Lot said, speaking respectfully. "I don't come to you as your brother, but as a servant and a father. My family is in peril, and I ask that you entreat my lord uncle to save our lives." "What help can I be to you, beloved Lot?" Sarai asked. "This famine has grown too severe for us to endure," Lot said. "My family needs food. I have 2 daughters, a son, and my darling Otto is with child. We cannot survive in these conditions. We must return to Padan." Sarai put down her knitting and closed her eyes in sorrow. Though she had no children of her own, she was not unsympathetic to her sister-in-law. She would not have the children of her servants die, and so Lot's words stung her in addition to her own condition. "I understand," Sarai nodded. "Please implore my lord uncle to return to Padan," Lot continued. "I fear that we will die out here in Canaan ere long. It confirms my fears." "Which fears are these?" "My lord uncle has disowned me in his heart and will give his inheritance to Eleazar." Sarai scoffed and slapped Lot across the face. Don't be foolish, my brother. You are his blood, and the son of his brother Haran. He would not forsake you as for a servant. Why does he not take us to some place with water and food? Lot asked. We are not able to provide for ourselves here in Canaan. Sarai sighed. I will speak to him on this. You have my word. And I don't want to hear you saying another word about Abram disowning you. He loves you as surely as his own life. Is this indeed so? Lot asked. It is so, Sarai nodded. He told me himself that he feels the death of our father Haran was his fault. Because of this, he feels obligated to provide for us and protect us. Surely he won't abandon you in your hour of need. I hope not, Lot sighed. With that, he rose up to his feet, embraced his sister, and departed back to his own tent. That evening, when the day's work was over, Abram came back to his tent. He bore a grim expression upon his face, which did not improve when he was reminded that there was no food for dinner. He grumbled and punched the ground in frustration, sighing deeply. Behind him sat Sarai, who was reading his mood and came to his side. What troubles you, my lord? She asked. The famine, Abram groaned. The pastures grow brown. Even the goats can't find anything to eat. And they eat anything. He chuckled mirthlessly. All the brooks and wells have dried up. We could dig for new wells, but we haven't enough food for such hard labor. Lot is concerned for his family, Sarai stated. Otto's unborn child may be threatened if we do not find food for ourselves soon. I know, Abram groaned. But what can I do? We could go someplace where there is no famine, Sarai queried. And where would that be, Abram asked. I hear even the cities of the plain have been stricken by this famine. Even if there were such a land that hasn't been touched, we would be leaving the land of promise. Would the Eternal still favor me if I left the land he had told me to move to? Surely he would not be offended in this regard, Sarai said, placing her hand upon his shoulder. It's not merely for you, but for all of your servants, your household, and for your flocks. Abram sighed, his shoulders slumping as he let the burden fall off his shoulders of his mind and heart. Sarai caressed his cheek and kissed the place. Whatever choice you make, she said, know that I am with you all the way. You are? Abram asked, turning his head to look at Sarai. Of course I am, my lord, Sarai answered. You are my lord, and I am your wife. You are a good provider for this household, and we have lacked for nothing until now. I am with you, my lord. And my love. She buried her head in the crook of his neck, and he leaned down and planted a kiss on her forehead. Abram did not wait until morning, but gathered together Lot and Addo, Eleazar and Oni, and brought them into his tent. A few small clay lamps placed on the rug served as their only light in the steadily deepening darkness. My people, he said, as you all know, the famine that gripped the Northlands has moved down south. We are all suffering, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, men, women, and children. I am convinced that we must act soon to find greener pastures, or else all will be lost. He sighed. For myself, I am hesitant to leave Canaan, for this is the land that the Eternal promised us. I fear that if we leave, we will lose our claim to this land, having only been here a handful of years, and we may lose his favor as well. My lord, Eleazar spoke up, should you not consult the Eternal in this matter, and pray for his guidance? Be silent, slave, Lot snapped. Know your place, and do not presume to order your lord and master, upon whose food and water you wait. He turned back to Abram. My lord uncle, there is no time to wait or consult with oracles. We must act now, or else we will die. I know, Lot, I know. Abram nodded. But now we must decide where we can go to find water and provender for ourselves and our flocks. He smiled and gestured towards Lot and Addo. And for our little ones. But where can we go? Addo asked. We could return to Padan, Lot stated. We have people there. Nahor, our Lord Father Terah, and their household. Surely they will welcome us. Mamre told me that there is famine in Padan as well, Abram replied. We cannot seek for help in the land between the rivers. What about Addo asked. There could be fertile pastures there, could there not? That is a very long journey, sister, Sarai said to her sister-in-law. What few supplies we have may not last us for that journey. We may die before we reach the plain of Shinar. More importantly, Abram returned, north is the land of Nimrod. If we go there, we will be under his power. And I have a feeling he won't take too kindly for us making alliances with the Amorites, nor will he have forgotten his ancient grudge against me. If 50 years could not have removed it, I doubt 25 would either. And we are left with no choice at all, Lot exclaimed. Are we to die here in the wilderness of Canaan on account of this damnable famine? My lord, Eliezer spoke up, if I may be so bold as to speak, and not offend the young master, I have something to add to this. Speak, Eliezer, Abram said. There is a land further south than Beersheba and many leagues west, Eliezer began. They say there is a great river there, flowing down from the south into the great sea. They say it provides fertility to the whole land year after year. Perhaps the headwaters of this great river lie somewhere beyond the famine's reach. An excellent suggestion, good Eliezer, Abram smiled. May the Eternal bless you for your ceaseless service to this house. Tell me, Eliezer, the name of this good land. The land I speak of lies beyond the southern border of the land of the Philistines, Eliezer said. The land of Mizraim. There was a collective hush among the people in the tent. None of them had ever been to Mizraim, beyond the southern borders. All that they heard from that land were rumors. It was said that the kings of Mizraim were as powerful as Nimrod, though they were not as tall as him. Of course, there was with them the same problem as with all the peoples of the earth, namely, that, though they all came from the house of Noah, they too had forgotten the one true God. But that's a great journey, Abram noted hesitantly. Almost as long as the journey from Canaan to Padan. We might not make that journey either. The people of Mizraim speak a different language than us, Sarai added. We would be outcasts, foreigners. No one there we know to vouchsafe for us. Also, Abram stated, the land of Mizraim is beyond the borders of the land given to the house of Shem. If we moved there, we would be violating the ancient boundaries of our given land. We would be no different than Nimrod, who took the land of Canaan from the house of Shem. Tell me, Eliezer, Lot interjected eagerly. Any scruples about being instructed by a servant now vanished. What else do you know about Mizraim? What are its people like? Is it a rich land? It is said, Eliezer added, that in the land of Mizraim, gold is as common as dust. Lot's face lit up at these words. I'm in favor of going to Mizraim. Lot, please, Abram spoke up. We must think about this first. What's there to think about? Lot asked. It's a rich land. It's fertile. We won't just survive there. We will thrive and prosper. But it's not our land, Abram stated. We belong here, in the land of promise. Lot groaned in frustration, tearing his domed kippah off his head. Ugh! Sarai gave him a piercing glance, as if to silence her brother with her eyes. Under the gaze of his older sister, Lot did not shout or yell, but paused for a moment to master himself. My lord uncle, he finally said, having calmed himself, we would not be forsaking the land of promise. We would only be sojourning temporarily in a foreign land to provide for ourselves and our families and our flocks. Think of your servants, who have served you admirably for all these years. Would you give them starvation as the reward for their diligence? Abram turned to Sarai, hoping for support in this matter. It is a long journey, yes, she said, nodding, and we do not know their language. But there is little choice in this matter. My lord uncle, Lot said, I beg you, we must decide now. If so, we can be packed first thing in the morning and depart in haste to save ourselves from this famine. Abram looked at Lot, whose brown eyes were full of pleading, and then back at Sarai. She nodded gently at him. Turning to the others, he saw Otto and Eleazar staring in eagerness at him, waiting for a decision. Though Otto was Lot's wife, she was part of their family, and waited on his decisions even as everyone else did. Eleazar did not express his opinion in this matter, for Abram knew that he would go with him no matter where he went. Slowly, Abram heaved a heavy sigh and nodded. Very well. We shall sojourn in the land of Mizraim. The story continues in chapter 12.